So, in the meantime, in the US, a couple of movements started to take shape that would change how we think about evolution once again. I will present them in somewhat random order because they started to emerge around the same time and influence back on each other. But I think it makes sense to start off with what is often called now human behavioral ecology. What do behavioral ecologists, what do they do, and who are they, first of all? Human behavioral ecology is concerned with the study of human behavior. Here are some important individuals that have done groundbreaking work in studying human populations, often in remote places around the world. What they are interested in is understanding what kind of behaviors are adaptive in a specific environment. There's also one individual, Napoleon Chanon, who again uh, called much attention to this movement and became highly controversial. He studied the Yanomami, a tribal group in the Amazon region, and he was an anthropologist. He passed away in 2019. He was an anthropologist who started to collect kinship information, so who's related to whom, and linked that to all sorts of other behavior patterns. And one of the claims, the Yanomami, his anthropological work, the book that he published in the I think in the 60s, The Fierce People, it became a huge bestseller. But what he started to show is that those individuals, men, that were more aggressive were more likely to have more offspring. So he started looking at the behavior patterns and which behavior patterns seem to be more adaptive from an evolutionary perspective. As you can imagine, again, this created a huge storm of contention. He teamed up with medical researchers and he started vaccinating people in the Amazon because they didn't have immunity against a lot of diseases that we often are quite immune to, or like can weather better. So he started vaccinating together with medical researchers groups against a measles epidemic that was breaking out. And so he got into trouble with the church, and then a journalist called Patrick Turney, he interviewed some church officials that were highly critical of Chanon's work, and that created a huge storm that ultimately led to his expulsion from the American Anthropological Association, a report that was later retracted because it was to a large extent based on false evidence by certain individuals. So the point here is that he observed behavior in groups that were very remote, using anthropological methods, but also using them in slightly unusual ways, which did not fit with the standard assumptions and methods of anthropology. And he also, because of his activism, got into trouble with local authorities, specifically church authorities, which created quite a few problems, and that again led to huge controversy. So the Darkness in El Dorado example again is one of those controversies where science and political thought and religious belief clashed. What do these what does this all mean for the understanding of human behavior? We talked about the three sources of influence on behavior, so genes, environment, and culture. How do human behavioral ecologists in typical relate to that? They primarily focus on the role of the environment. How does behavior, so that's why here we have the E for the environment, how do behaviors meet the environmental demands? So on average, most human behavior ecologists are relatively mechanism neutral. So they look at variation in human behavior and study whether it's adaptive to variations in the environment. They often use mathematical models, mathematical approaches. So Shannon, for example, he looked at kin relations and then studied the level of genetic relatedness and correlated that with um, like number of children. Many other um, projects often use like mathematical analyses of behavior, mathematical models, and then compare that with behavior that they observe in specific environments. So the idea is really studying the environment and seeing whether the behavior that is displayed in the environment actually is the optimal behavioral phenotype. So it's really focus on the phenotype and seeing whether the phenotype fits the environmental demands. So it's relatively neutral in relation to genetic or social psychological mechanisms. Having said that, Shannon actually was also often associated with the next school of thought that I will talk about in just a few minutes, which has a much stronger focus on genetic mechanisms. But on average, the human behavioral ecologists are relatively mechanism neutral. So their focus is really on adaptive behavior. But all this kind of argument on adaptation, adaptive behavior, etc., comes with problems. And here's a paper that Gold and Levantine wrote in the late 70s, which I think is very amusing in some level and very informative. On one hand, they draw on Voltaire's famous satirical book, and on the other hand, they link it to ideas from architecture to argue that adaptation is actually very difficult to study if if you try and understand how a specific trait actually appeared. So they focused, for example, on this arc in the St. Mark's Cathedral in Venice. And they write, the great central dome of St. Mark's Cathedral in Venice presents in its mosaic design a detailed iconography expressing the mainstays of Christian faith. Three circles of figures radiate out from a central image of Christ: angels, disciples, and virtues. Each circle is divided into quadrants, even though the dome itself is radially symmetrical in structure. Each quadrant meets one of the four spandrels in the arcs. You see the spandrels up here below the dome. Spandrels, the tapering triangular spaces formed by the intersection of the two rounded arches at right angles, are necessary architectural byproducts of mounting a dome on rounded arches. Each spandrel contains a design admirably fitted into its tapering space. An evangelist sits in the upper part, flanked by heavenly cities, so this picture here, and the design is so elaborate, harmonious, and purposeful that we're tempted to view it as the starting point of any analysis, as the cause in some sense of the surrounding architecture, but this would invert the proper path of analysis. So the argument here really is that we could start just focus on this particular feature here and assume that everything was built to focus our attention on this space, which has so much meaning within the 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 structure of the whole dome. But Stephen Jay Gould's argument is that this is just a byproduct and it was embellished afterwards. And if we don't understand that this is potentially just an artifact of a larger or a different structure, then we completely mess up the whole understanding of what is going on. So the search for adaptive behavior is always, held back by these kind of questions. Is it actually something that is functional, and functional in what context and for what and when. So here is an attempt to break this down, because we can think about whether behavior is adaptive today, so it's functional behavior that increments reproductive success, or is behavior an adaptation? So is it evolutionary built for this particular role, right? And this is really tricky to work out, because we can have different variations of this now. So if it was built for a specific role and still performs that role, we have what is called a current adaptation. So it remains adaptive because there's some continuity in the selective environment. If there's a behavior that was built by evolution for a specific function, but the environment has changed, then it's no longer adaptive, so it's a past adaptation. On the other hand, we could also have behaviors that are built for a specific function, but we could have behaviors that are not built for a specific function, but because the environmental demands changed suddenly, even though the behavior was not built for this particular purpose, suddenly helps to increase reproductive success. So this is what Stephen Jay Gould in a later study would call exaptation. So something that enhances fitness now, but was not specifically built for this natural selection. And then of course we have the byproducts or the spandrels. So something that is just there, it was not built to enhance fitness, and it also does not help us to have survive better in a specific environment, or pass our genetic information on. So this is the challenge that any researcher that wants to study evolutionary processes has to deal with. Is a specific behavior adaptive, and was it actually built for this adaptive role over evolutionary time frames? And this can often get very complicated. So we have to work through all these possibilities, and we can also ask, is it potentially a secondary adaptation? Classic example is feathers. All right, so we see all these birds around us with feathers, and they allow flight. But was it actually built for this particular purpose? This is a huge discussion. Did feathers develop for enabling flight? Most likely, these days, people think not. There are two theories out there. One is that feathers initially developed similar to hair in mammals, so the same way that we have hair on our skin, as a form to protect us from the elements, so as a temperature regulation mechanism. And then only as a secondary adaptation later on, it enabled our bird ancestors, the dinosaurs, to actually take flight. A different theoretical argument is that feathers developed as display, or as a form of display, specifically in order to woo potential mating partners. But this is an idea that we will talk about in much more detail when we talk about sexual selection, right? So, but the core idea is feathers most likely are a secondary adaptation, because they evolved initially for a different purpose, and then over time only slowly became useful for flying. So we always have to ask ourselves, is something, if we want to look at adaptations, we first of all have to ask ourselves, is it variable? Because remember, this is related to the core questions and the core principles of natural selection according to neo-Darwinian theory. Is it variable? So for example, our hand has 5 fingers. Is it actually variable? No, because a lot of animals have 5 fingers. So it's not something that we can study in terms of um, in terms of an adaptation. We could now look at some other features of our hand, for example, the way our fingers work. So the our ability to touch our index and thumb. It's the opposable thumb idea. We could look at that, but that's a different question because here now we move to questions about variability in the specific features that vary across species. The second issue we have to look at, for example, if we look at hairstyles, is this variable? It is highly variable, of course, but the question now is it heritable? And if we look at Darwinian selection only, then obviously, hairstyle is something that will disappear within a couple of weeks. And the third question that we have to look at, does it affect reproductive success? Right? So here again, we could think, okay, a hairstyle could actually influence to what extent you can attract partners or, like drive partners off. But again, here we have to cautiously go through all these different questions in order to think about to what extent is something variable between individuals within a species and across species. How is it actually heritable? Is it inherited in genetic information or through some other mechanism? And we will go through some of these mechanisms in due course. And does it actually do anything in relation to increasing the likelihood of reproduction and passing on information across generations? So the interesting question really is behavioral ecology. What is quite interesting is that they are relatively neutral on the gene versus culture debate that will become really important in the next domain that we will, or the next school of thought that we're going to look at. And I just ask you, to what extent do you think is this actually a useful stance to take?